Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming February of 2017 regional auction. And the pair of rifles that I grabbed to look at today are a pair of Peruvian Mausers. Now, maybe not a whole lot of thrilling excitement for Peruvian Mausers, but actually I think the rifles have some neat features and there's a cool story behind them. Now the first thing that jumps out at you when you look at these is they have this Langevisier, so-called rollercoaster sight. And typically we're used to only seeing that on German World War I Gewehr 98 rifles. But, well, this rifle here, the model 1909 Peruvian, is basically the commercial export version of the World War I Gewehr 98. That is, however, not the first Mauser that Peru used. The first one is this, the 1891, which is distinctive both for having, again, this sight, although we'll get to why this sight is on this rifle, but more so for having this single stack inline magazine that drops down below the stock. The 1891 was really the first commercially successful Mauser bolt-action repeating rifle. It wasn't the earliest date that they were manufactured. The Belgians adopted a rifle like this in 1889, but the 1891 was largely sold internationally, in particular to Argentina. Now, we're going to delve a little bit into South American politics here, but not too deep. Argentina and Peru kind of had this common enemy in Chile. And at the time that this is taking place in the 1890s, Peru is still smarting from a substantial military defeat at the hands of the Chilean army. And so they didn't have a very substantial military at this point, which is kind of part of why they'd lost that war in the first place. And there's some pretty realistic thought that the Argentine government was interested in helping to rearm Peru because they had this mutual enemy. Or maybe not strictly speaking enemy at the time, but mutually distrusted neighbor. How about that? So what happened was the Argentine government bought many thousands of 1891 pattern Mausers, and in fact they're all marked on the side rail of the receiver, Modelo Argentino, 1891, and allegedly they discovered at the end of one of these contracts that, well, they didn't actually have enough money to pay for it, and so rather than risk, loss of face internationally and diplomatically and potential credit issues maybe with DWM in the future, they opted to basically transfer and resell a part of this order to Peru. So Peru got rifles that were in the S, T, U, and W serial number ranges. And they bought about 30,000 rifles total. And these rifles had already been manufactured, but before they left Germany, they had been manufactured, they'd been delivered. The rifles were actually shipped back to Germany, where the Argentine crest was removed and the Peruvian crest applied, and then sent to Peru. So we have 1891 pattern Mauser rifles in Peru, happily being used. This was a big step forward for the Peruvian military. It was really their first standardized bolt-action repeating rifle. Apparently they had used a small number of Commission 88 rifles earlier, but not in huge numbers. So Peruvian Army adopts the 1891. It's in 7.65 by 53 millimeter, commonly called 7.65 Argentine, although this was a caliber that was developed by Mauser for commercial rifles. It was the 7.65 Mauser cartridge. And at this point in history, this is a heavy, long, round-nosed bullet. Spitzer hadn't been adopted yet. I should point out, these purchases were made in 1901, so 10 years after the first iterations of these Mausers. And by 1901, they're not the newest thing around. So it's not that long before Peru decides to buy some more guns, and at this point they're able to just do the purchasing on their own without any help from Argentina. And they buy what are designated model of 1909 Mausers, and this is, instead of an 1891 pattern, this is an 1898 pattern, the final best iteration of the bolt-action Mauser, really. And at this point, it's really a copy of the German military rifle. The Germans identified that as the Gewehr 98. The commercial version here is 1909. It's still in 7.65 Argentine, or 7.65 Mauser, or 7.65 by 53, but at this point, they are actually using spitzer bullets, so a shorter, pointed, lighter weight bullet that has much better long-range ballistics. And that is the cartridge that this Langevisier sight is set up for. Now, they did actually make a couple of change requests to make these rifles a little bit different than regular Mauser 98s. And specifically, they changed the diameter of the barrel shank and the cocking piece so that they would interchange with the 1891 pattern guns that Peru already had. And that makes a lot of sense. If they were going to rebarrel the guns, which they would, and we'll get to that in a moment, they would be able to use the same barrels for both guns. Makes a lot of sense. So why don't we go ahead and take a closer look at these two, because this one in particular is in gorgeous condition. It's hard to find one original like this. And this one has actually been refurbished, and that shows us some interesting changes as well. So this rifle has been modified to an updated pattern. Originally, as I had mentioned before, these fired a heavy round-nosed version of the 7.65 Argentine cartridge, and when Argentina bought their newer pattern 1909 rifles, those were set up for spitzer cartridges. So they went back, the government went back later and updated all of the original 1891 rifles, or virtually all of them, to fire spitzer. And they did that by replacing a lot of the barrels, not necessarily all of them, but a lot of their barrels were in pretty bad shape. They'd used these rifles for a lot of training, and they'd seen a lot of hard use and a lot of corrosive ammo. So they bought barrels actually from SIG, replaced the barrels, and they replaced the rear sights at the same time with the same pattern of Langevisier Rollercoaster Sight as on the later rifles. This sight is calibrated for spitzer ammunition. The original sights were a flat 1891 pattern sight that was calibrated for the round-nosed ball. At the same time, they made a couple other changes to the rifles. The handguard here has been lengthened. The original 1891 pattern handguard was only about that long. And they also replaced the front sight, simply with a new version to be at the correct height and shape and size to match the new rear sight. When these rifles were refurbished by Peruvian arsenals, the arsenal guys were much more interested in functionality than they were in aesthetics. And so it's not uncommon to find the crest, which you can just barely see there. It says República Peruana. It's not uncommon to find that crest partially or even completely removed. If there was a lot of pitting or corrosion on the receiver, they would have polished it down before they reblued it, which is a second thing I should point out they did. These receivers were originally polished in the white, and when they were refurbished in Peru, they were subsequently blued. So that is why the top of this crest is mostly gone and why the receiver is blued. Looking at the markings here, we can see some of the Argentine lineage pretty clearly. Right here, obviously, it's the Mauser Argentine model 1891. And these two clasping hands, that little mark, that is an Argentine acceptance mark. That this was a rifle manufactured for Argentina and then rerouted to Peru. The serial on this one is in the W block, so one of the last of the batches that was done. And typically the original barrel would also have been serial numbered, but I believe this is a replacement barrel. There should be a SIG mark underneath the stock, but I'm not going to take the stock out for this video. If it were an original Argentine barrel, it would have a serial number on it, but when they rebarreled the guns, they didn't care. It was unimportant. It's not like you're going to accidentally lose the barrel and need to match it up with the rifle again. So the replacement barrels are not serialized. This is a bayonet for that 1891 pattern Argentine rifle. And while these of course also were procured basically through Argentina, while they remarked the Peruvian crest onto the rifles, they didn't bother changing anything on the bayonets. If we take a look here on the blade, yeah, it's the model Argentine 1891 marking. That crest underneath the word Argentino is the Argentine national crest, but the serial number is in the S block, which would be appropriate for the Peruvian rifles. So the bayonets, who cares, it's just a blade. Didn't bother making any changes to them. They look just like, in fact they are, Argentine contract bayonets. Now let's take a look at this really nice model 1909 Peruvian Mauser. First off, you'll notice that the barrel is blued, the receiver is in the white, the bolt is in the white, the bolt release lever is blued. This is correct. This is how this rifle was originally produced and shipped, and in fact the German Gewehr 88s are the same way. It was typically only with refurbishment that they would have blued receivers. So thanks to the fact that these were originally made for Peru and not an afterthought from someone else's contract, they have this really big, nice Peruvian crest marked on the receiver, and Mauser Original, right there. And they no longer have an Argentine marking on the side rail. This is Waffenfabrik Mauser, model of 1909, and a serial number right there. Got matching numbers on the barrel and the receiver. This indicates that the Peruvians did not, in fact, rebarrel this rifle because they wouldn't have bothered putting the serial number back on. The bolt, however, is mismatched, and we'll address why in a minute. As a commercial export Mauser, these also have a very nice Mauser crest stamped into the wood there, acceptance mark, and a disassembly or a unit disc there. This Langevisier sight, I think, is pretty cool. It's kind of a not the greatest sight to use. It's not the most well thought out sight. Of course, it zeroes at a minimum of 400 meters, which is really a remarkably long distance. This is indicative of this thought pattern when these rifles, small bore, smokeless powder rifles, were first introduced to the world militaries. Everyone assumed that because these cartridges shot far flatter and had far longer effective ranges than the old black powder large bore cartridges, that would mean that warfare would take place at much longer distances because the cartridges allowed it. And so the first generation of these rifles all had sights that were zeroed at these ridiculously long ranges, like minimum 400 meters. That would typically change. Even during World War I, the Germans adapted some of these down to a 200-meter zero. And by World War II, you'd be seeing more like 200 and sometimes even 100-meter zeros. So, in order to use this, we're just going to squeeze the button, and you can slide it back and forth. All the intricacy of this fancy-shaped sight is simply there so that it raises it the correct amount for whatever range you're trying to shoot at. The downside to that sight, aside from presumably its expense, is that the sight picture leaves an awful lot of stuff kind of sitting in your field of view with those big wings on the side. You saw the 1909 rifle here is mismatched, and there's an interesting story explaining why. Apparently, the Peruvian military, with these rifles that were older reserve rifles, like these were when they were finally surplused off, they were stored with the bolts removed and the bolts kept separately. And that was to prevent or at least discourage theft, because you could steal the guns, but they wouldn't really be usable without bolts. Well, these rifles were imported by a company called Interarms, run by a guy named Sam Cummings, who is responsible, pretty much personally responsible, for a massive amount of the military surplus firearms that exist in the United States today. But when he bought these, he bought them all without bolts. And so he was able to bring them in some sort of status as parts rifles or incomplete rifles, and substantially reduced his paperwork overhead for that import. And once the rifles were in the country, he then just went back and bought all the bolts and brought them in too, and presto, complete guns. However, very little effort was put into making sure that the matching number bolts went into the matching number rifles. The Peruvian military hadn't really cared about this either. They were interchangeable, and so they really didn't bother paying much attention to matching numbers when rifles were refurbished or went through the arsenal system. And the same thing happened when they came into the United States. So it's pretty darn rare to find a Peruvian Mauser, 1909 pattern Mauser, with the original matching bolt. Now this is a correct bolt, just not the one with the same number that the rifle has itself. So Peru would go on to do a little bit more with some of these rifles, the ones that hadn't been exported. They did convert some of them to 30-06. They would go on to order more Mausers. Eventually, they actually changed from ordering from Germany to ordering from FN in the 1930s, but that is a topic for another video. If you would like to own these two, they are actually both being sold as part of the same 4-gun lot here at Rock Island. If you take a look at the description text below, you'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page for these two rifles and the other two that also come with them, and the bayonet that comes with this as well. So you can take a look at their pictures, their descriptions, their price estimate for the lot, and if you decide you would like to have it yourself, you can place a bid right there on their website. Thanks for watching. All right, since you're still here, I'll point out one funny thing that I noticed. What's amusing to me is this is actually the second rifle I have found that has this problem. You'll notice that that rifle appears to be zeroed for 900 meters, and it's all the way back. Someone actually took the rear sight apart and they put the slider on backwards. It ought to be flipped around so that the arrow is pointing at 4.